Hello everyone and welcome into Silence. Thank you very much for attending. I'm Kate McLaughlin, Professor of English Literature at the University of Oxford and co-founder of the Silence Hub, along with my colleagues Dr. Miriam Kalija, who you can see on the screen, and Professor Willem Coyken. Now, today we should be hosting Professor Michael Freeden, Emeritus Professor of Politics at the University of Oxford, but unfortunately, Michael is having technical difficulties joining us. So rather than delay you any longer, what we're going to do is start the discussion and hope that the people who are working miraculously behind the scenes can somehow bring him with us. So what we're going to do to start with is read a passage by Pierre Bourdieu from Outline of a Theory of Practice. And then Miriam and I will discuss it a little. If you, as I hope you will have any questions, please put them in the Q&A, which you'll find on your Zoom screen, or else in the chat. Now, here is Willem Coyken, who's the third member of our Silence Hub team, appearing briefly. Hello, Willem. So, Nikki, if we could have up the first slide, please. This is from Pierre Bourdieu's Outline of a Theory of Practice. I will read the extract. So, because the subjective necessity and self-evidence of the common sense world are validated by the objective consensus on the sense of the world, what is essential goes without saying because it comes without saying. The tradition is silent, not least about itself as a tradition. Customary law is content to enumerate specific applications of principles which remain implicit and unformulated because unquestioned. The play of the mythico-ritual homologies constitutes a perfectly closed world, each aspect of which is, as it were, a reflection of all the others. A world which has no place for opinion as liberal ideology understands it, i.e. as one of the different and equally legitimate answers which can be given to an explicit question about the established political order. The critique which brings the undiscussed into discussion, the unformulated into formulation, has as the condition of its possibility objective crisis, which, in breaking the immediate fit between the subjective structures and the objective structures, destroys self-evidence practically. It is when the social world loses its character as a natural phenomenon that the question of the natural or conventional character, fusé or nomo, of social facts can be raised. So that's from Pierre Bourdieu's Outline of a Theory of Practice from 1977. And I'm delighted to say that Michael Coyken has just joined us in the nick of time. So Michael, welcome. I've just read the passage from Pierre Bourdieu. I think you might be muted now, but while you unmute yourself, I'll just give you a brief introduction. Sorry, everybody, for doing this the wrong way around. As I said, Michael is Emeritus Professor of Politics at the University of Oxford. He directed the Centre for Political Ideologies at the university's Department of Politics and International Relations and was founding editor of the Journal of Political Ideologies. In 2012, he was awarded the Sir Isaiah Berlin Prize for Lifetime Contribution to Political Studies by the UK Political Studies Association. Michael's publications are too many to list, so let me just mention The Political Theory of Political Thinking of 2013, Liberalism, a very short introduction of 2015, and Conceptual History in the European Space, which he co-edited in 2017. Michael's currently writing a book about concealed silences in the political sphere, and today he's going to talk about 4 passages related to that work. And I'm sure you're all delighted that you'll get to hear his expertise rather than mine. Please do, as I say, put questions to Michael in the chat or Q&A section, and I will field them as we proceed. Michael, over to you.
Right. Well, delighted to join you. My expertise, my technical expertise is not as great as other expertise I may or may not have, but let's begin. So the political is not only about governance, states and institutions with Doric columns. It relates to the everyday practices and human transactions in which all of us engage daily, making decisions, ranking things in terms of importance and urgency, allocating the distribution of who gets what and when, expressing consent and opposition, and of course, exercising power. The political is always about the quest for finality in individual goals and social arrangements, a finality that's always pursued and always elusive. So many of our political practices are undertaken without our being conscious of participating in them. And let me illustrate. Catching a bus to town doesn't appear at first glance to be a political act, and it usually isn't interpreted as one. But it is a highly typical example of the ordinariness, normality, and routine of political processes, acts, and thinking. And it contains practices that are not only fundamentally political, but silently so. Those practices include choosing a destination, that is to say, identifying a future aim, planning the means to attain it, and deciding on the timing. Standing in a queue, that is to say, accepting and participating in orderly ranking of access rights to a public good. Purchasing a ticket, that is to say, obeying a law that demands payment for services and the evidence to prove that compliance. Instructing a person to act by ringing a bell to make the driver stop, that is to say, intervening in and controlling a course of action. And accepting the temporary authority of the driver delegated by a bus company in navigating through such a prearranged route. Of course, any one of those may be infringed or flouted, but even such resistance, challenging or disobeying, is a palpable political occurrence. Of course, the purpose of the journey may be saliently and deliberately political, attending a demonstration, traveling to a polling station, or defying a racially imposed ban. But the centrality here is all the more likely to obscure the equal significant but muted political conformities or acquiescences we perform daily. So we're all conversant with the important phenomenon of silenced voices, intentional silencing or deliberate silences, keeping quiet, shutting up, as well as the unthinkable, the unspeakable, the ineffable, and the inarticulable. But I'm particularly interested in silenced silences, the unnoticeable, the unknowable, and the unconceptualizable. And those are silences that are concealed, are themselves concealed from a person's view and from the view of other members of their society, and even occasionally from the view of scholars such as us investigating social and political life. And that means that as students, we have not only to listen to silences, but listen for silences, scan the universe, so to speak, of the social universe for silences, when, for example, we expect speech or sound and it isn't forthcoming. Recall Conan Doyle's curious incident of the dog that did not bark in the nighttime. And deeper down even, there are silences of whose existence we have no idea at all, due to the epistemological frameworks that debar us from detecting them. And in addition, just to suggest that politics is not just narrowly about the political, the practices of political thinking, whether acknowledged or obscured, are intertwined in many disciplines and walks of life: history, literature, music, psychoanalysis, linguistics, anthropology, philosophy, religion, and on and on. So I begin with an excerpt from Pierre Bourdieu, a leading French sociologist. From his book, Outline of a Theory of Practice. And he writes, because the subjective necessity and self-evidence of the common sense world are validated by the objective consensus on the sense of the world, what is essential goes without saying because it comes without saying. The tradition is silent, not least about itself as a tradition. Customary laws contend to enumerate specific applications of principles which remain implicit and unformulated because unquestioned. The play of the mythico-ritual homologies constitutes a perfectly closed world, each aspect of which is, as it were, a reflection of all the others, a world which has no place for opinion as liberal ideology understands it. That is, as one of the different and equally legitimate answers which can be given to an explicit question about the established political order. So it's only when the social world loses its character as a natural phenomenon that the question of the natural or conventional character of social facts can be raised. And just one or two comments on this. So Bourdieu invokes the habitus, which is a system of unorchestrated, regulating and underlying structures that generates fundamental social practices. The political aspect of its unnoticeability means that legitimacy issues are taken for granted, particularly in traditional frameworks in which people are even unaware of the very question of legitimacy. The holy grail of legitimacy craved by political systems is delivered inadvertently by silence, not by people, not by members, not by citizens. And it's only when societies are in a state of major crisis that voicing dissent occurs. And that applies to many of our thoughts, even in open societies, not only in traditional ones. I mean, think of the phrase that Bourdieu just used, self-evident. Nothing is self-evident. Or the facts speak for themselves. Sorry, I can't hear the facts speaking. We speak for the facts never speak. So we superimpose our voices on their silence. So that's the first expert. Do I continue straight to the second, or what? How do you want to handle it?
No, I think what we'll do now is see if any of our attendees have any questions.
Sure.
If you do, please put them in the Q&A, which I'm monitoring, or the chat. While we're waiting for people to do that, Michael, I wonder if I could ask a question, which is this, that you can think of all kinds of prejudices and assumptions that don't survive being brought into the light, being brought into discussion, as Bourdieu puts it.
Yeah.
But I also wonder if there's a case for leaving the unformulated, because that's what oils the wheels of society. So if we were to reflect upon democracy and priorities every time we stood in a bus queue, nobody would ever go anywhere.
Quite. Yes, I mean, well, our everyday practices always take things for granted, precisely what Bourdieu is saying. And we have to take things for granted. We can't wake up every day in the morning and think of 1,000 things we need to re-establish or challenge yet again. Luckily, our mind functions in such a way that we simply accept 99.9% of our own habits and customs. But the 0.1 is crucial, because that's where things happen. The problem here is to distinguish between the routine sciences and the important sciences. And very often it is the important sciences that are buried deep underneath our practices and our thought processes.
So do you have an example of an important silence that you think should be uncovered?
Well, yes. I mean, that has to do with there are these certain kinds of silence. Let's take the unconceptualizable. In societies which are heavily religious, and most of them are on this planet, it is impossible to conceive the absence of God. It is simply so ingrained in one's everyday practices, in one's routine from morning to night. But there is a silence, a very deep silence about the possibility or impossibility of God. Well, certain questions are never actually put to the test. They're so deep and actually so dangerous in some way that they sink way below into something that we can't even conceive of. Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of State for Defense, was ridiculed for talking about known knowns, unknown knowns, and unknown unknowns. But this man is a philosopher. Precisely the unknown knowns, which everybody made fun of, which is the crucial thing. Things we don't know that we don't know. And I mean, partly my answer is, well, if I also don't know that I don't know, so I will have to find some other perspective or some other person or some other society that may be able to illuminate what I cannot understand myself, because we're all caught in the grip of things that we don't know.
I think that's fascinating, and how we go about registering those unknowns, I think, is a really interesting question. We have a question in the Q&A from Anne Ployne, who says, Thanks for a wonderful beginning. Hopefully, without anticipating the rest of the discussion, could you speak to the way you have listened for silences in your work and give some methodological advice for people also looking to pick up such silences in their work?
Yes, I mean, that is not an easy question to respond to in a couple of minutes, but I think that there's something intuitive about our work as researchers. When I said earlier, we have to scan for silences. Why aren't these women complaining about the way they're being treated? Why is nobody concerned with the notion of hereditary leadership and take this for granted? I mean, there's so many things that are taken for granted, and the only way of getting out of it is actually to have a comparative juxtaposition of different cultures, because other cultures may tell us we are blind to things or deaf to things that for them are obvious and we don't know. So it's a question of a gradual sort of maneuvering around known and particularly gaps, unknown questions, problems. I'll come back to this in some of the later excerpts.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions from anybody on this particular passage? Otherwise, I think we can maybe move on to the second passage, if that's all right with you, Michael.
So the second excerpt concerns the famous example of tacit consent. Ah, you've got it here, right.
Yeah.
Do you want to read out the whole thing?
Yes, please.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this calls for some water then. So every man being naturally free and nothing being able to put him to subjection to any earthly power, but only his own consent, it is to be considered what shall be understood to be a sufficient declaration of a man's consent to make him subject to the laws of any government. There's a common distinction of an express and a tacit consent, which will concern our present case. Nobody doubts but an express consent of any man and entering into any society makes him a perfect member of that society, the subject of their government. The difficulty is what ought to be looked upon as a tacit consent and how far it binds. That is, how far anyone shall be looked on to have consented and thereby submitted to any government when he's made no expressions of it at all. And to this I say, that means Locke says, that every man that hath any possessions or enjoyment of any part of dominions of any government doth thereby give his tacit consent, and is as far forth obliged to obedience of the laws of that government during such enjoyment as anyone under it, whether his position be of land to him and his heirs forever, or lodging only for a week, or whether it be barely traveling freely on the highway, and in fact it reaches as far as the very being of anyone within the territories of that government. If we can continue straight to the second excerpt. But, is it there? Yeah. Thank you. No, that's back to the first. Anyhow, I'll read, here we are, yes. But since the government has a direct jurisdiction only over land and reaches the possessor of it only as he dwells upon and enjoys that, the obligation anyone is under by virtue of such enjoyment to submit to the government begins and ends with enjoyment. So that whenever the owner who has given nothing but such a tacit consent to the government will by donation, sale, or otherwise quit the said possession, he is at liberty to go and incorporate himself into any other commonwealth, or to agree with others to begin a new one in vacuis locis in any part of the world they can find free and unpossessed. Whereas he that has once by actual agreement and any express declaration given his consent to be of any commonwealth is perpetually and indispensably obliged to be and remain unalterably a subject to it and can never again be in the liberty of the state of nature. So 3 very brief points about this. First point, Locke goes for performative rather than vocal or verbal indicators of consent, which is unusual, and it may well be that he does so unknowingly, or at least with not full awareness. In contrast to the recent willingness of many political theorists to depart from the predominantly logocentric conventions of the discipline and to recognize performativity as an extension to their standard analysis of ideas, conceptual patterns. Locke says nothing about performativity. He just assumes that this is a form of consent, and we have to superimpose our understanding on that. Second point, Locke is keen to expand the range of consent as a sign of a free people by reading a silent undercurrent that accompanies certain practices. Although the practices related to tacit consent may not themselves be political, he claims that using public goods, a highway, some economic transactions, taking lodgings, or ownership are political simply because they implicitly and silently accept the laws of the land and obedience to them, even if people are unaware that they are in a state of political obligation. And third, and this is the extraordinary twist that very few commentators notice, those who are silent are freer than those who consent expressly. Express consenters are perpetually bound to membership of the society they have elected to join. But because the tacit consenters have not declared such consent, they are at liberty to exit the Commonwealth and join another. The privilege of silence enables the shuttling back and forth between the political and the non-political, or the political and the pre-political, affording those who adopt this silence a unique and manifest political advantage, a flexibility unburdened by the constraints of commitment introduced by text or speech. That's number 2.
Thank you so much, Michael. This is a fascinating passage, and the things that you pick out of it are so interesting. Again, if I think Miriam has put a question on the chat asking whether you could reflect on silence as a noun and a verb. So this is getting to the idea of, I suppose, silence as being verbally, or consent being verbally expressed, and consent as a silent act.
Yes. Silence is a state of being, or a state of well, either non-talking or non-noise. There's a difference here between sound. There's human sound, there's non-human sound, and there's noise, which can be either a non-human sound or simply just noise without being, shall we say, harmonious in any way. The difference, I think, which is interesting, is between silence as a verb, between silencing and being silenced. Silencing is an agentic act. It is something that somebody does to someone. But you will have silences that are non-agentic. I think there's a crucial difference here. Silences that are the result of certain unconscious or unaware practices, and silences that are also the result of certain social structures that people internalize, again, without thinking. So we are talking here about silence as a verb, and that's why I'm talking really about silenced silences, but not necessarily silenced by human beings. The silence can also be by the social structures. It can be by internal constraints, which of course psychoanalysis is one area where this thing is explored. Here we talk about the inarticulable. When for instance, Wilfred Bion, the famous psychoanalyst, said, "I was listening to the silence, and the silence told me things that I was unaware of in the analyst-analysand relationship." So you can, in a way, listen to the silence by inferring something about it. And it's interesting, of course, that the standard psychoanalytic situation does not involve looking at a person. So you get no clues from the face. You just hear the silence or the voice, almost ethereal. And so it sharpens, it highlights the voice-silence relationship. this is probably not exactly answering the question, but once you start me going, I just continue.
Well, yes, thank you. Thinking about this passage from Locke, there seems to be a distinction being drawn, as you say, between the person who gives verbal express consent and the person who gives consent through silence, and that the one who speaks is actually more tightly bound than the one who is silent. And those two groups it seem to be mapped onto me to perhaps the citizen and the migrant. Right. And I'm trying to think what would be the kind of political thinking behind this distinction that Locke's making.
Yes, well, the fact, it's not clear to me at least that the people who are silent have consented. When I first started teaching this to undergraduates, I asked myself, tacit consent, it can be consent, but as again, we don't hear anything. It can be dissent, it can be apathy, acquiescence. So, I mean, there's no reason actually why we need to interpret this as consent. And this is, of course, Locke now interfering with or manipulating his argument in a certain way. There's a reason, of course, why Locke wants to include tacit consent as a form of consent, but let's remember, it's just being tacit, it's just being silent. The question of migrants and citizens, I think, is important. Migrants actually have a voice, but they have a reduced voice. They have a voice which is shut off in some directions, but which is open in other. They can complain. They can voluntarily agree to the laws and customs of the place they have entered. I would say that they are people with reduced voices, not necessarily people without voices. I think we are now in modern societies, or in some of them at least, encouraging migrants to express their voice.
I'm interested that as well, I'm not sure whether what Locke is thinking about the position of women here, if he's thinking about them at all. But if there's a sort of silent, if silence is taken to be consent to the political order, does that include all members of the political order? Are some silences, as it were, louder than others?
Yes, that's a good question, and has to do also with the intensity of silences. Yes, some silences are louder than others, or some silences are more intense than others. In all these passages, he doesn't say anything particularly interesting.
Sorry, ignore that. That's just my phone. Sorry.
Doesn't say anything interesting or important about women, because the convention is that when he talks about man, he talks about human beings. I don't think he excludes women, but obviously they play a very limited role, and it took a long time before they had the political rights and the right to participate actively in a society. So I would just take this as given, but it is not something that preoccupies his thoughts in the 17th century.
So there's a question from Dave Postles on the Q&A. Is silence habitual obedience to a sovereign in a legal positivist sense?
My short answer is no. Silence is not any legal obedience whatsoever. That's precisely why, because it doesn't indicate anything. Whatever it indicates has to be read into it by the interpreter, or by the savvy participant who may eventually realize what she or he is doing when they are silent. But I think the interesting thing here is that silence is not necessarily part of a normal political transaction. I mean, we have something called the silent majority, for instance, the phrase silent majority, which was used by Richard Nixon and has been used many times since. this is actually not a group that is acquiescing or accepting legally the arrangements of the state. Quite the opposite. The silent majority is normally a group of people where other people speak in their name. They superimpose themselves on that silence. I mean, you find this in current day populism, when it's the people, the populist elite. They all say it's the populist versus the elites, but the populist speakers are themselves elites, and they impose their own views and understandings because the majority is silent, or because what they think is the majority is silent. And therefore, I can represent the majority because they're not talking, I have to talk in their name. So I wouldn't regard the legal aspect of silence as central. I mean, obviously, I'll give another example. The marriage ceremony in the standard church marriage ceremony, it says, people speak now, I mean, the objection, speak now or forever hold your peace. Now, here's an interesting thing, because here you have a shifting backwards and forwards of who is in power, right? The person officiating is in power, but then the person officiating says, okay, one moment, I transfer the power to you for half a minute or whatever. Now you have got the crucial decision to make whether you want to speak or be silent. If you're silent, gradually the power ebbs back to me, the officiator. But there's a very interesting political transaction here between the officiator and the congregation, in which power flows backwards and forwards through silence. And of course, it can be stopped by speech.
And that silence is almost like a speech act, weirdly, because it has the effect of legitimizing and sanctioning the right.
Yes.
There's a question from Danai Azaria, rather long, but I'll read it to you. Do you think that Locke's silence are freer, i.e. the people who are silent are freer because of the system that Locke considers? He considers domestic legal political orders based on central lawmaking and central law enforcement.
Yes.
But the same may not be the case in the international legal order. There's no central lawmaking or enforcement. States silently accept that they are governed by international law as a system, and they cannot escape this if they want to be considered states.
Yes, I quite agree with that. In the national order, you don't have a central authority against which you can either speak or be silent. But there are, of course, major silences in the international order as well. I mean, I'll give one example of phrases that are totally misused or manipulated to some extent. When people talk about the liberal world order, the liberal world order is not liberal. The liberal world order is at the moment run by governments who are mostly conservative or even beyond conservative, in other words, pretty unpleasant quasi-dictatorships. But the liberal world order is actually a masking device to suggest that, okay, in this international order, without a central authority, there are free transactions that take place between states, and this, of course, isn't true because as anyone knows about the world order, it is heavily slanted towards big states, and not only towards states. You see, when we now talk about an international order, we're not necessarily talking about states, about governments. We can talk about international agglomerates. So when the Brexiteers take back control, it seemed not to occur to them that even if on paper we took back sovereignty, it doesn't mean that we take back control. Who supplies our food? Who supplies our oil and various other scarce resources? We are always actually dependent on other people's cooperation. So these phrases actually, again, silence and hide processes that sometimes even hide them unconsciously, not necessarily deliberately. I don't think there's malevolence when people talk about the liberal world order. Many of my colleagues in the universities around Britain talk all the time about the liberal world order, and I say, hey, wait a moment. It actually isn't liberal.
Sure. Thank you. Just to finish off on Locke, there's an interesting question from Rachel Bryan. If by Locke's account tacit consent via silence is still seen as consent, does his model have anything to say about the relative levels of responsibility a tacit versus an express supporter of, say, an immoral regime might be assigned?
He assumes that the notion of consent has to do with legitimate and moral regimes, because he's talking about the establishment of a free, rational society by a group of individuals who decide to create a political entity. So I don't, let's be clear about this. He's talking about what is known as the Pact of Association, not the Pact of Government, a distinction which is quite well known in French political thought. It's the pact of entering into a society, not the agreement between the people and the government, which is not actually a pact for Locke, it's a trust. And that's another question. But the question it's a question of the kind of political anthropology that, or philosophical anthropology that Locke is subject to, and that is that societies are formed, societies are created. It's not a concept that we are happy with or comfortable with now in the 21st centuries, but this was the standard assumption model that societies come from nowhere in this void, empty space, and eventually create social arrangements or social entities out of actually nothing. There's this wonderful phrase where Locke says, "In the beginning, all the world was America," right? Just undiscovered free space, and eventually people come together and they fashion themselves into a society. So this is the underlying assumption. And so the voices and the silences have to do with the question of fashioning, of entering and exiting a society. And, yeah. The uniqueness, I think, of Locke, although I don't think again he's aware of it. The point being that the people who don't consent vocally are freer than those who do consent vocally. It twists this almost upside down. If you haven't agreed to a government, you can go in and out and form another government, form another society. Sorry, if you don't agree to not government, to a society, you can form another society, and or return to that society. You can go backwards and forwards. It gives immense freedom to these people, right? So silence bears freedom with it.
Interesting. Interesting to think of it that way around. This is fascinating discussion. I think we should move on to our third piece. Yes. I will keep an eye on what's still in the Q&A to talk about, but let's go on to Thomas Carlyle now.
So this is from Past and Present by the essayist and historian Thomas Carlyle, extolling the epic and heroic, if mythical, spirit of the English worker. The cloudy-browed, thick-souled, opaque practicality with no logic utterance, in silence mainly, with here and there low grunt or growl, has in him what transcends all logic utterance, a congruity with the unuttered, the speakable, which lies atop as a superficial film or outer skin, is his or is not his, but the doable, which reaches down to the world center, you find him there. Thy epic, unsung in words, is written in huge characters on the face of this planet. Seamows, cotton trades, railways, fleets and cities, Indian empires, Americas, New Hollands, legible throughout the solar system. As for me, I honor in these loud babbling days, or the silent rather. The talent of silence is our fundamental one. Deeds are greater than words. Deeds have such a life, mute but undeniable, and grow as living trees and fruit trees do. And he ends this passage with my much honored, illustrious, extremely inarticulate Mr. Bull. And then the next passage, all from book 3 of Past and Present, he talks about the silence of the stars over us and the silence of the graves under us. And between these two great silences, the hum of all our spinning cylinders, trades unions, anti-corn law leagues, and Carlton clubs goes on. Stupidity itself ought to pause a little and consider that. I tell thee, through all thy ledgers, supply and demand philosophies, and daily most modern melancholy business and cant, there does shine the presence of a primeval unspeakable, and thou wert wise to recognize not with lips only that same. So what we have here is that great social and political projects are not to be understood, according to Carlyle, as constructs of ideas and disputation, but as the hard graft of labor conducted silently and wholeheartedly. The language here is the language of noise, of hum, of industry, not the sound of speech. So this kind of earthy, can-do materiality with its productive creativity takes precedence over verbalized schemata. And silence is not absence of noise here, but absence of voice. Because in this world, the silence of human beings clears the way for their transformative activity. And so, two questions. To the question, which silences matter, Carlyle responds that human silence matters, whereas non-human noise, which is at the service, in as much, shall we say, as it is at the service of human endeavor, doesn't count as breaking the silence. And to the question, what counts as silence? Carlyle responds that silence does not require stillness or inactivity, unlike, say, people who recount their experience in the wilderness, where silence and stillness.
Hello, I think participants are starting to come back. I'm really sorry about what just happened. Everybody, we're just all cut out. I suppose it's ironic, but maybe also appropriate. It happens in the middle of a session on silence. So we've had a little silence to gather our thoughts. Unfortunately, we've lost the questions from the Q&A. So if you'd like to repost those, please do. Michael, I think you had you'd read the passages from Thomas Carlyle's Past and Present, and noted the difference between, or different kinds of silences, non-human voices, or sorry, non-human sound, human voices, human speech. Yeah. This is maybe a tangential question, but just at the end of the first passage from Carlyle, is that phrase, my much honoured, illustrious, extremely articulate Mr. Bull. Is Mr. Bull, is he meant to represent Englishness?
John Bull.
Yes.
Yes.
So does Carlyle have a view of the English? Because I realised he was Scottish as a particularly silent
yes, but
nation.
I think he's speaking about the achievements of mainly the English-led revolution, not revolution. I mean the English-led empire and the imperial achievements of Britain. We're talking about somebody who was a notable conservative thinker at the time.
Yes.
You can see that he's praising the physical or the material achievements of British, and also the sort of the dogged nature of the English worker, who just sets himself, and it is usually himself, to work in the name of the empire, and doesn't bother with all these airy-fairy supply and demand philosophies, as he calls it, or ledgers or accounting systems. He just gets down and does things. So, yeah. But I think what is interesting here is also the distinction between good noise and bad noise. right? The hum of the machines. Demestre, the French philosopher, also talks about the hum of the machines when he talks about the French state, but he talks about the complete silence of the hum. It's so well coordinated that no noise comes when the French state operates, so to speak. But there's an interesting parallel here between the idea that certain interactions among human beings can create a hum, a noise, which is highly beneficial, and it in a way it trumps the silence, trumps the sound of people. You know, that quasi silence, the hum is a real reflection of the earthiness of British or English achievements at the time.
Absolutely. So I'm interested in the sort of political assumptions in this as well, I suppose. First of all, whether in a sense there's an element of anti-intellectualism in it. If you say that, you know, speech, which is about articulacy, debate, discussion, enlightenment, etc., that's being written off in favor of the hum of machinery.
Yes.
And I also wonder, I mean, you mentioned he's a conservative thinker, whether there's a sort of sense of not really hearing the noise of the workers that are operating that machinery.
Yes, exactly. That's precisely it. In fact, the workers do best when they do rather than when they talk. That is their achievement. But he's also weighing against the philosophers, the abstractors, the supply and demand philosophies, the ledgers. I mean, all those people who try to quantify and give numbers to the achievements of the British nation. And there's a parallel here too, because Burke also, his complaint about the French Revolution is precisely that it's mathematical, right, rather than organic. This is the height of the expression of organicism. These things just, they're alive, they happen, you know, we don't have to intellectualize them.
And you get this a century later in the thinking of D.H. Lawrence. Actually, he's writing about precisely this. I suppose Dickens is as well in Hard Times. It's kind of anti-utilitarianism.
Yes.
We have reached 3 o'clock, and we were meant to be broadcasting from 2 to 3. I see that we still have some people attending, and what we'd like to do, I think now, is if you have to go, thank you very much for coming and goodbye. I think those of us who can will stay and look at the last passage, which is a very interesting one. And another question has come up on the Q&A, which I will ask once we've got onto the Trouillot. So, Michael, would you like to read the last passage, please?
Yes, I will give a slightly shortened version of the last passage.
Thank you.
So this is a person called Michel-Rolph Trouillot, an academic anthropologist from Haiti who then worked at Johns Hopkins and Chicago universities. And I think that his book is a brilliant and highly readable study, Silencing the Past, of the nuances of silence in Haitian history. And it's one of the best, for me, one of the best instances of theoretical insights on silence gained from empirical research. And I came across this book completely by accident, and I was wowed by it. So he writes, silences are inherent in history because any single event enters history with some of its constituent parts missing. Something is always left out while something else is recorded. There's no perfect closure of any event, however one chooses to define the boundaries of that event. Thus, whatever becomes fact does so with its own inborn absences, specific to its production. In other words, the very mechanisms that make any historical recording possible also ensure that historical facts are not created equal. They reflect differential control of the means of historical production, at the very first engraving that transforms an event into a fact. And then he continues later in the book. Not only was the Haitian Revolution unthinkable and therefore unannounced in the West, it was also to a large extent unspoken among the slaves themselves. By this I mean that the revolution was not preceded or even accompanied by an explicit intellectual discourse. One reason is that most slaves were illiterate, and the printed word was not a realistic means of propaganda in the context of a slave colony. But another reason, I think that's the important one, is that the claims of the revolution were indeed too radical to be formulated in advance of its deeds. Victorious practice could assert them only after the fact. In that sense, the revolution was indeed at the limits of the thinkable. So these passages point not only to the first order unconceptualizable silences, but for me what's interesting is the second order inaudibility that affects research and scholarship. This is not so much about the silence of the people, but the silence of the historians and the other researchers and scholars who themselves invade the material that they're writing about with new silences, even as they put text and meaning and understanding on a particular set of events, they concurrently dismiss and hide other events that happen at the same time. He gives a very nice example. Instead of talking about the discovery of America, which is the standard Columbus story, one might just talk about the invasion of the Barbados by Castilian soldiers. Another way of putting it. Nobody talks about it in that way.
So this is fascinating politically and historiographically. Here, this idea of truly radical action is unspeakable because it's unthinkable, is presented in a positive light. But I think about the riots, the invasion of the US Capitol a couple of weeks ago, and I wonder whether this sort of idea of a kind of sublime violence is really terrifying.
Yes, but it certainly wasn't a silent violence. It was a very noisy one, both in word and in deed, and aggressive and violent. I think what he's talking about is that there's a particular point in history where those who participate in it don't realize what they are doing. And because they have not yet, I don't use the word, but I'll use it anyhow, intellectualized it. They've not yet thought about it in a systematic way. Maybe they can't, because the means of conceptualization at their disposal may be rather limited because of lack of education, because of inability to develop a perspective outside their own everyday life. So there are two things here. First of all, it's the impossibility of talking about something while it is happening, or some things while they're happening. And the second is the importance of retroactive understanding, the superimposition of understanding on something that at the time was silently, or that certain aspects, crucial aspects of it were silent, unrecognized, unknown, unacknowledged.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. So there's a question from Paul Flather, which it's about Locke, but I think it also is pertinent to this. He says, for Locke, consent must be given for acceptance of a government, and this can be withdrawn as from Charles I. And then he asks, are elections today the expressed consent for our future governments? So if you have not voted for a government or a referendum, are you free from obligation of acceptance or acquiescence?
The short answer is that no, because it would be impossible to organize a society in such a way. It applies to any 51% majority, for instance, when 49% of the people are disenfranchised. It happens particularly in our first past the post system. I think this raises another question. It's very important. It's the question of what the majority does with respect to the minority. So in Britain we have winner takes all, but the opposite of winner takes all is loser takes nothing. And it's the loser takes nothing that is the alarming thing here. So in a way, what a reflective and responsible democratic society needs to do is to listen to the voices of those who have lost as much as of those who have won, and that was something totally absent in current populism, for instance. There's no interest whatsoever, just ramming through a majority, and the unity and monolithic understanding of what a voice is. There's really only one voice, the voice of the people, we the people, the will of the people. I mean, we've been inundated with these expressions for the past 2-3 years ad nauseum. The question is, when a minority needs to be listened to when they have no option but to fall in with the voice or the decision of the majority. But the falling in is crucially dependent on the way the majority treats them. And it is perfectly understandable, maybe even order, to resist a majority where the majority gives no voice whatsoever to the minority.
And it strikes me that's another form of listening to silence, when you're listening to a disenfranchised minority.
Exactly.
Does anybody, anyone who's attending, have any more questions that they'd like to put in the Q&A or on the chat? It doesn't look like it. Okay, well, in that case, at 3:10, I'm going to declare this session at an end. Thank you to everybody for attending. Thank you so much, Michael, for your input, for your expertise, for some fascinating discussion.
And the passion behind it.
And the passion behind it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to the Torch people, including particularly Nikki, for making this happen. Sorry to everyone about all the technical problems. We are going next time to have a In Conversation and Into Silence about silence and gardens. So look out for that, and we will be in touch with further details. Thanks and good afternoon.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you for listening.